Emily Carter was 19, the kind of young woman whose gentleness could calm a room without saying a word. She didn't chase attention, didn't walk around believing the world owed her anything. She simply worked, studied, and tried to build a future with the small tools life handed her. Her parents used to say she carried light in her hands, not because she was perfect, but because she knew how to make others feel less alone. For them, she wasn't just a daughter. She was the child they prayed for, the hope they held on to when money was tight and life wasn't kind. On October nights in Tacoma, the streets usually felt harmless, the kind of harmless folks trusted without thinking twice. That evening in 1971 was no different. The diner on 6th Avenue buzzed in its usual rhythm as Emily wiped down tables, tied her apron, and told her coworkers she'd see them tomorrow. She packed her sketchbook, zipped her worn sweater, and stepped into the cool night air with the same confidence she'd had every night before. It was a short walk, a walk she'd taken over and over again, a walk everyone in her life believed would carry her safely home. But that night swallowed her whole. Her mother kept checking the clock, listening for footsteps on the porch that never arrived. Her father paced the living room until the carpet felt thin. When the phone finally rang, it wasn't Emily. It was a neighbor saying they found a backpack near the corner by the old hardware store. Emily's backpack, torn open, sketches scattered, a sleeve ripped from her sweater like someone had tried to drag her away from the life she was fighting to build. Their world cracked right there. Because from that moment on, silence became the loudest sound in their home. How safe do you really feel walking the streets you trust? She was minutes from her door, minutes. If danger can pull someone off a familiar road without a trace, what makes any of us untouchable? Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. When police arrived at the Carter home at 1:14 a.m., they moved with the stiff urgency officers often have when they hope a disappearance is just a misunderstanding. They asked the usual questions. Was she upset? Did she leave willingly? Did she argue with anyone? Questions that cut into her parents like accusations instead of help. Emily's mother kept repeating the same words in a shaking voice. She called me every night after work. She would have called. Her father clenched his fists until his nails broke skin. He knew his daughter. He knew her routines. He knew something was wrong long before anyone with a badge believed him. Detective Alonzo Holt was assigned the case within the hour. He'd worked missing persons for years, but this one carried a weight even he couldn't ignore. The torn sweater sleeve, the scattered drawings, the bag abandoned like someone wanted the family to panic. It all pointed to force. Yet the department treated the first night like Emily had simply gone off with a friend and lost track of time. They canvassed the area half-heartedly, knocking on doors, asking tired neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual. Most said no, a few said maybe. One said she heard a car engine rev, but couldn't describe it. It wasn't enough to hold on to, but it was enough to haunt Emily's parents for decades. By sunrise, the case already felt off balance. Too many officers were juggling too many emergencies, and Emily's disappearance slid into a growing pile of unresolved worries. Holt requested extra patrol units. He was denied. He asked for roadblocks. He was told to wait. He asked for immediate media involvement. The department wanted to avoid public alarm. Every delay felt like a betrayal. Every hour lost felt like a door closing. Emily was gone, and the clock was eating her alive. The first real lead came from a teenage boy who worked the night shift at the gas station on 6th Avenue. He said he saw Emily walking past around 10:40 p.m., her backpack slung over one shoulder, her head down like she was exhausted from the long shift. Right behind her, he noticed an unfamiliar car crawling along the curb, a dark sedan with a busted headlamp. He couldn't recall the plate number, couldn't name the driver, couldn't even swear it was following her. But it was the only detail investigators had. They clung to it like a lifeline. Detective Holt pushed hard on that lead. He checked repair shops, questioned late-night drivers, and stayed up for hours reviewing logs and traffic reports that barely existed in 1971. But Tacoma was a city in transition, growing fast, changing faster. and the sedan could have belonged to anyone. Meanwhile, another tip surfaced. A regular from the diner claimed he saw Emily talking to a man in a brown jacket earlier that evening. Another customer swore she left alone. The stories tangled, contradicted, and canceled each other out. By day 3, the department no longer trusted any of them. Then came the name that would derail everything. Tobias Rourke, a former classmate of Emily's. He had a temper, he had a reputation, and someone claimed they saw him near 6th Avenue that night. That was all it took for rumors to form into a storm. Holt brought him in, questioned him for hours, checked his alibi. It held. Every detail checked out. But the town didn't care about evidence. They wanted a villain they could point to. The next suspect arrived just as quickly. Dominic Leone, Emily's boyfriend. People whispered that they had argued earlier that week. No one knew what the argument was about, but whispers grew into assumptions, and assumptions grew into blame. Dominic broke down during questioning, begging Holt to find her, insisting he had nothing to do with her disappearance. His grief was real, raw, and shaking. But fear has a way of blinding communities to truth. By the end of the week, Tacoma was drowning in accusations but starving for facts. The air grew colder, and so did the leads. Every conversation felt like smoke slipping through Holt's hands, visible for a second, gone the next. Emily's parents watched the investigation crumble in real time, powerless to stop it. Nothing added up, no suspects stuck, no answer came, just a growing silence that felt like it was swallowing the entire city. As the investigation wavered, the Carter household slipped into a kind of grief most people never witness, the kind that doesn't explode but collapses quietly, room by room. Emily's mother, Patricia, stopped sleeping. She sat at the kitchen table each night, clutching the phone, waiting for a call she knew might never come. Every time it rang, a wrong number, a reporter, a cruel prank, she answered with hope that cracked a little more each time. Her father, Henry, took the opposite path. He left the house every morning before dawn with a flashlight and a stack of Emily's flyers, searching alleys, empty lots, bus stops, the waterfront, anywhere his mind imagined she might be. Neighbors tried to help at first, but as days turned into weeks, the crowds shrank. People returned to their routines. Life resumed, but not for the Carters. Detective Holt visited their home often, not as an officer, but as a man carrying guilt he couldn't shake. He'd update them on every tip, even the useless ones, because he couldn't bear the way silence hollowed the house. Patricia always asked the same question. Did she call? Did anyone see her? And he always gave the same answer, not yet. It never got easier to say. By the second month, something inside Henry began to fade. He no longer looked like the man who built their home with his own hands. He moved slower, spoke less, carried himself like he was losing pieces he'd never get back. Patricia noticed, but she didn't know how to help him when she couldn't even help herself. The worst part wasn't the lack of leads. It was the slow realization that their daughter's name was starting to disappear from front pages, replaced by new stories, new tragedies, new distractions. Tacoma had returned to work, returned to school, returned to normal, but the Carters were stuck in the night Emily vanished, unable to move an inch beyond it. Grief didn't knock on their door. It moved in, stayed, and refused to leave. 2 weeks into the search, Tacoma's police department felt the pressure rising from every side. Reporters demanding statements, neighbors forming their own theories, and city officials insisting the department show progress. But progress was the one thing they didn't have. Every lead stalled, every witness contradicted the one before, and every hour lost made the truth harder to reach. Detective Holt pushed his team past exhaustion. They retraced Emily's route over and over, hoping daylight might reveal what darkness had hidden. They knocked on doors until their knuckles throbbed. They interviewed anyone who had been awake that night, bartenders, taxi drivers, factory workers finishing late shifts. But no one had seen her, or no one wanted to admit they had. The sedan sighting tortured Holt, a dark vehicle near the diner clocked by a gas station attendant. The man thought it was maybe blue or black or something in between. It wasn't enough to build a file, let alone a case. Meanwhile, another witness insisted Emily was seen talking to a man near the old laundromat, But when questioned again, he changed the story entirely. Evidence didn't vanish. It never appeared in the first place. The longer it went on, the more the public shifted from urgency to resignation. Search groups dwindled. Posters faded in the rain. People began treating Emily's disappearance like an unfortunate chapter the town didn't want to reread. The conversation switched from "we'll find her" to "maybe she left on her own." Detective Holt felt that shift in the air. It stung like betrayal. Emily had done nothing wrong, nothing that justified being forgotten so quickly. He fought to keep the case alive. But with every dead end, it became harder to convince the department that she hadn't simply vanished of her own choice. The weight of that idea that the city might accept a lie just because the truth was inconvenient pushed Holt deeper into frustration. He kept the case open on paper, but he knew the momentum was slipping. Cases don't close only when paperwork says so. They close when people stop caring. And in Tacoma, caring was fading faster than clues. By late November, the energy around Emily's case had drained completely. What began as a city moving in unison, soon, flashlights, search grids, volunteers lining streets, had dimmed into a tired whisper. People had jobs, families, routines. Life, uncaring as always, kept moving even while Emily's family stayed frozen in the same unbearable moment. Detective Holt stood in front of the board one last time, staring at photos he had memorized. Emily smiling in her apron at the diner, the torn sleeve found near the alley, the blurry snapshot of the sidewalk where her backpack had been recovered. Nothing fit together. Not one lead had grown stronger. Not one new clue had emerged. The department called it what they always call cases that stop breathing: inactive, a word that hurts more than unsolved. Inactive means don't expect progress. Inactive means you're on your own now. When Holt delivered the news to the Carters, he couldn't even look them in the eye. Emily's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, her voice cracking as she asked the same question she had repeated for weeks. Isn't someone out there still looking for her? Holt wanted to promise her yes. He wanted to swear he'd tear the city apart until he found the truth. But promises don't hold weight when the system has already walked away. All he could offer was a quiet nod, the kind that carries more regret than hope. The phone stopped ringing. Reporters stopped showing up. Neighbors brought fewer meals. Even the pastor stopped mentioning Emily's name during services. For the Carters, the quiet was worse than the search. At least during the search, people cared. Silence felt like a second loss. By the end of the year, Emily's case file was placed into a locked cabinet in the basement of the department, buried behind boxes from other forgotten tragedies. A label was slapped across the front of her file: open, no active leads. But grief doesn't have labels. It doesn't follow policy. It doesn't shut down because the paperwork says so. For the Carters, the world didn't return to normal. It simply returned to moving without her. The search ended, but the silence began. The year after Emily vanished felt like a lifetime stretched thin. Her parents, Harold and Ruth Carter, stopped living the way they once did. They moved through their days in a quiet, heavy rhythm, speaking less, eating less, breathing only because their bodies forced them to. It wasn't grief that destroyed them. It was the waiting. Harold tried to be the pillar everyone expected him to be, but the weight hollowed him from the inside. He returned to work at the shipyard, but coworkers noticed how he stared at the water as if expecting it to give something back. Every siren in Tacoma made him flinch. Every knock on the door made him lift his head, hopeful for the first time, only for the hope to die again. By 1975, their marriage wasn't a marriage anymore. It was two people holding on to opposite ends of a memory that refused to fade. Harold stopped attending gatherings. He stopped laughing. He stopped looking people in the eye. The nights became worse. He'd wake up calling Emily's name, breath stuck in his throat, sweat on his palms. The doctor called it stress, but grief isn't a medical condition. It's a slow fire that burns without flame. In 1982, Harold collapsed in the living room, clutching the arm of the sofa where Emily once sat during family movie nights. The doctor said it was heart failure. Ruth knew better. A heart can only break so many times before it quits. Ruth buried her husband next to an empty plot she had once hoped would never be needed. And after that day, She carried both her grief and his, alone. She refused to let Emily's name fade into silence. She attended every community meeting, every city council session, every local gathering where the microphone was open. She talked about her daughter even when people looked down, embarrassed, wanting the subject to end. But Ruth didn't stop. She couldn't. Keeping Emily's name in the air then was the only way she knew to keep her daughter close. Still, over time, the crowds around her shrank. Friends moved away. Neighbors stopped visiting. People grew tired of a story with no ending. But Ruth didn't grow tired. She grew louder. The world kept turning. Ruth remained in place. Her fight wasn't noble or inspiring, it was survival. Tacoma grew, shifted, and rebuilt itself over the years. New storefronts, new families, new ambitions crowding the same streets Emily once walked. What used to be close-knit blocks became neighborhoods filled with people who didn't know the history beneath their feet. Children who hadn't been born in 1971 rode their bikes past the corner where her backpack was found. Couples held hands near the diner where she worked without realizing those walls once held her laughter. Time didn't erase what happened. It simply made people comfortable forgetting. By the mid-'80s, the older generation spoke less about Emily, not because they didn't care anymore, but because the story made them feel helpless. The younger residents barely recognized her name, and those who did only knew it as a cautionary tale whispered by parents trying to keep their kids close after dark. Don't walk alone at night. Remember the girl from 6th Ave. But they didn't say her name. Not because they meant harm, but because the town had slowly taught itself to swallow uncomfortable truths. Streetlights were replaced, roads repaved, buildings renovated. Life moved on everywhere except inside the Carter home. Detective William Finn, the man who had once worked the case until exhaustion cracked him, stayed in Tacoma long after retirement. He tried to live quietly, gardening and tending to small hobbies, but the weight never left him. He carried Emily's photo in his wallet for decades, pulling it out during quiet evenings as if asking the universe the same question he had asked in 1971. Where are you? He never found the answer. Sometimes he'd walk past the old diner, pausing at the crosswalk as if his mind still expected to see a familiar figure turning the corner. He didn't speak of the case publicly anymore, but those close to him noticed how his voice always softened when he mentioned her name. He was a man who had learned to live with regret, not loud, not dramatic, just waiting for a moment the world never gave him. Tacoma's skyline rose higher. Its streets grew louder. But in the quiet spaces, alleys, old houses, back rooms of diners, there were people who still felt the chill of that night in 1971, even if they couldn't explain why. The city changed. The wound didn't. Ruth Carter aged faster than the calendars on her wall. Each year added lines to her face, but none softened the ache inside her chest. In the early years, she fought with fire, demanding answers, questioning every lead, pushing detectives until they had nothing left to give. But as time dragged on, her anger turned into something quieter, heavier, and far more painful. Every October 12th, she held a vigil for her daughter. In the beginning, dozens gathered, neighbors with flashlights, friends with trembling hands, strangers who didn't know Emily but cared enough to stand in the cold. They prayed, cried, and promised they would never stop searching. But promises fade when hope grows thin. By the late 80s, only a handful showed up. A few candles, a whispered prayer, and a silence that felt too loud. Ruth noticed it, but she never said a word. By the 90s, only one person remained. Her. She would stand at the corner of 6th Ave, the same place her daughter was last seen, clutching a small photo frame with a picture of Emily smiling in the sun. She never spoke during those vigils. She just stood there, letting the wind tug at her coat, letting the cars pass without slowing. Some drivers looked, most didn't. To them, she was just an old woman mourning a story they no longer understood. People moved on. Life moved on. But Ruth stayed in that one moment of her life that never healed. Neighbors tried to comfort her. Some left flowers. Others brought meals. But nothing filled the silence inside her home. A silence that began the night Emily didn't return and never stopped growing. By the early 2000s, Ruth rarely left the house. Her hands shook when she held Emily's belongings, and her eyes carried a glare that revealed a truth she never spoke aloud. She no longer believed justice would come in her lifetime. And she was right. Ruth Carter passed away in 2009 with her daughter's case still unsolved, her memories still unanswered, and her fight still unfinished. The people who attended her funeral barely filled 2 pews. But in her room, tucked inside a dresser drawer, officers later found a small box containing a candle, a matchbook, and Emily's photo. The same items she brought to every vigil. She kept them ready until the end. Detective Michael Finn should have closed the file and moved on like everyone else. He had solved dozens of cases in his career, earned awards, and trained younger officers who respected him. But the disappearance of Emily Carter never stopped clawing at him, even after the department officially shelved it. He carried her school photo in his wallet, not for show, not for guilt, but because he couldn't forget the look on her mother's face the night she begged him to, "Please bring my baby home." That plea lived inside him longer than any promotion or commendation ever could. Over the years, Finn rechecked the file whenever he couldn't sleep. Late nights in the precinct became routine. Him alone under the buzz of desk lamps, flipping through the same photos, rereading the same reports, hoping one detail would suddenly speak. But the details never changed, and neither did the ache. He watched Tacoma rebuild itself around the case. New houses, new people, fresh stories. The city grew louder, but the silence around Emily's name grew louder too. Sometimes on his way home, Finn drove past the spot where her backpack was found. He'd park for a moment, headlights cutting across the sidewalk, and he'd sit there, waiting, thinking, wishing. He told no one about those stops. Not his wife, not his colleagues. It was his private ritual, the only way he knew how to honor a promise he never fulfilled. When retirement finally came in the late 90s, he packed his things into a cardboard box. But before walking out, he opened the cold case drawer one last time. Dust layered the folders. Time had bled the ink on labels. Yet Emily's file still sat near the top, a reminder that some stories refused to die quietly. He didn't take the file home, though he wanted to. Instead, he slid her photo from his wallet, replaced it with a fresh printout, and tucked the old one deep inside the drawer. A small gesture, but symbolic, as if he was saying, "I'm leaving, but someone else will come. Someone has to." Finn passed away in 2015. When his daughter emptied his belongings, she found Emily's picture, still in his wallet, creased, faded, and worn thin from decades of being touched. He never solved her case, but he never abandoned her either. Some ghosts follow you willingly. Emily was his. The city moved forward, but Emily's mother, Helen Carter, didn't. For years she fought, begged, wrote letters, and stood in front of every microphone that would listen. At first, people stood with her. Neighbors, church groups, community leaders. They lit candles, printed flyers, and promised they wouldn't forget. But promises age. And people with busy lives drift away. By the late 80s, Helen realized the crowd at her yearly vigil was shrinking. Some years only 5 people came. Some years 3. Eventually, it was just her standing on the corner of 6th Ave, holding a small candle, letting its glow fight the darkness for as long as it could. Cars passed by without slowing. Most drivers didn't even recognize the name on her poster. But she came every October, rain or cold, because that was the month her life split in half, before and after. She kept Emily's room untouched. Her art supplies stayed on the desk. A drawing she'd started the week she vanished hung on a corkboard, a half-finished portrait of the Tacoma waterfront. Dust gathered on the shelves, but she refused to wipe it away. "The world took enough," she said once. "I won't erase anything else." In the early 2000s, Helen pushed for the case to be reopened. She attended every city hall meeting, stood at every public forum, and mailed petitions to officials who barely skimmed her letters. Some officers treated her gently. Others saw her as an inconvenience. None gave her what she needed most: the truth. As the years passed, her steps slowed, her voice softened, and her hope changed shape. It didn't fade. It hardened. It became something she carried like weight, not fire. People whispered that she should move on. They didn't understand that moving on wasn't a path she could walk. It would mean accepting that her daughter vanished into thin air, and Helen refused to let the world rewrite Emily into something that could be forgotten. By 2010, the vigil was entirely silent. No candles from neighbors, no reporters, no volunteers. Just a single woman standing with a photograph held to her chest. A mother who refused to surrender to time. When she died in 2017, the obituary mentioned her love for teaching, her volunteer work, and her devotion to her daughter. But it didn't mention that she spent almost half a century fighting a battle alone. The truth is, Tacoma didn't forget Emily because it was cruel. It forgot because forgetting is easy. Helen made sure remembering wasn't. For almost half a century, Emily Carter's entire life, her fear, her final steps, the clues that might have saved her, sat inside a single cardboard box in the basement of the Tacoma Police Department. Ask any officer from those years, and they'd swear it was somewhere down there. Some remembered it vaguely. Most didn't remember it at all. It sat on a metal shelf with peeling paint, stacked between cases involving stolen radios and warehouse break-ins, as if Emily's disappearance carried the same weight as missing property. The label had faded so much that only fragments of her name were readable. Dust thickened over the lid until it blended into the shadows around it. Not once in those decades did anyone break the tape or look inside. A forgotten box, holding a story no one remembered how to tell. Inside were photos from the search, a sweater sleeve sealed in old plastic, a torn notebook page with half a sketch, and a hair sample too small for 1970s technology to understand. Evidence that once mattered felt like leftovers from a nightmare the city tried to pretend never happened. Detective Roy Finn, long retired by the time the 2000s arrived, visited the evidence room once before moving away. The clerk on duty opened the basement door for him, watched him walk among the shelves, but didn't follow him in. Finn stood there in silence, tracing his fingers over the box where Emily's name should have been, whispering something no one else heard. Then he walked out without taking anything, as if touching the past was all he had the strength left to do. After that day, the box returned to darkness. New officers came, old officers left, protocols changed, storage was reorganized. But somehow Emily's case never resurfaced in the shuffle. It stayed invisible, hiding in plain sight. Not because no one cared, but because time has a way of burying the things people are too afraid to face. By 2019, the box had sat untouched longer than Emily had been alive. The evidence inside had waited through 9 presidential terms, 2 wars, and generations of families who had never heard her name. The truth wasn't gone. It was simply waiting for someone who refused to look away. In early 2020, Washington State quietly announced something the public barely noticed: the creation of a new cold case unit, built to confront the failures that had buried decades of families in unanswered grief. It wasn't a glamorous project. It wasn't funded with enthusiasm. It was born out of pressure, guilt, and the growing realization that too many names had been lost to time. What no one knew was that this small unit would collide head-on with a story Tacoma had abandoned. Detective Lena Rowe, 33, transferred from Seattle homicide with a reputation for never letting go of a case once it caught her attention. She wasn't from Tacoma. She didn't grow up hearing whispers about the girl on 6th Ave. She had no memory of Emily's smile, no personal tie, no inherited shame from the community. Maybe that's why she saw what everyone else had ignored. On her first week, Rose stepped into the evidence basement and stared at the endless rows of forgotten files. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just understanding the landscape she had inherited. A clerk mentioned, almost casually, "Some of these boxes ain't been touched since the 60s. That was all it took. Rose pulled a pair of gloves from her pocket and scanned the shelf numbers. Something tugged at her attention, a small box shoved so far back it seemed almost hidden. Its label cracked and unreadable. She dragged it forward and felt the weight shift in her hands. Inside the lid, faint but still present, were the letters C-A-R. T-E-R. She froze. Not because she knew the story, but because the dust on the box was thick enough to hold a fingerprint. Proof that no one had opened it for decades. She carried it upstairs, placed it under the brighter office lights, and began to read the files that had been locked away since 1971. The sweater sleeve, the old photos, the nail scrapings, the witness statements from a different era. Everything inside felt like a plea from another lifetime. By the time she closed the lid again, her jaw was clenched and her eyes were burning. Emily wasn't just a case waiting for closure. She was a young woman whose entire story had been pushed out of view because it made people uncomfortable. Roe whispered, "You deserve better." And with that, Emily's 49-year silence finally cracked. Time didn't heal the wound, it just hid it under dust. For 50 years, her killer blended in. If time can hide evil that long, what's hiding near you? Subscribe. Protect yourself. By 2021, most people in Tacoma had stopped speaking Emily Carter's name out loud. The world had moved on, new buildings had risen, families had come and gone, but one person refused to let her story stay buried. Detective Lena Marquez, newly assigned to Washington's cold case unit, entered the archives expecting routine work. Instead, she found an entire generation of forgotten victims sealed inside cardboard boxes. One in particular called to her, a small file so worn that its edges had begun to curl inward. A fading label read, "Carter Emily, 1971. She paused, not because she recognized the case, but because something felt wrong. A 19-year-old girl had vanished, and no one had touched her evidence in nearly 5 decades. To Marquez, that wasn't just negligence. It was abandonment. She carried the box into the lab, placed it on a steel table, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were items that once belonged to a living, breathing young woman. A torn sleeve, scattered fibers, in a small envelope containing fingernail scrapings collected the night Emily never came home. For a moment, Marquez just stood there, absorbing the weight of everything time had nearly erased. All those years, the world kept spinning while her story remained frozen inside a box no one cared to open. Marquez whispered softly, "Emily, someone should have fought harder for you." And with that, the case that had slept for half a century opened its eyes. End line of subsection, not the final section, end line. The moment the lid lifted, the past began to stir. Detective Marquez laid each item by name out under the cool glow of the lab lights, careful not to disturb a single thread. These weren't just objects. They were the last pieces of Emily's final moments, frozen in time, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The torn sweater fibers still clung together in a small plastic bag, sealed since Nixon was president. The fingernail scrapings, barely visible, sat inside a fragile paper envelope marked with handwriting that had faded into a faint gray. And then there was the strand of hair, short, coarse, belonging to a man no one had ever identified. A strand that should have cracked the case decades ago, if only the technology had existed. Marquez knew what she was holding wasn't just evidence. It was a message Emily had left behind the night she fought for her life. She moved quickly, submitting every sample into Washington's forensic genome sequencing system, a machine capable of pulling information from material smaller than a grain of dust. While earlier generations of investigators saw dead ends, Marquez saw possibility. She stayed in the lab long after the others clocked out, pacing slowly between the machines as they processed each fragment. Hours passed. The building grew quiet. Then the monitor flashed. A partial hit. A living relative. A surname Tacoma hadn't spoken in decades. Rowan. Marquez froze, heart pounding. The hair found under Emily's nails carried the genetic imprint of a family that still lived in Washington. The past had finally answered. End line of subsection, not the final section, end line. For the first time in 50 years, the case pushed back. Detective Marquez printed the genetic report and stared at the highlighted name. Rowan. A family line that had been in Tacoma for generations. Carpenters, teachers, church volunteers, people no one ever suspected of anything beyond quiet living. Nothing about them fit the image of a man who could steal a young woman from the street. But the DNA didn't lie. Someone in that bloodline had crossed paths with Emily in 1971. Someone had touched her. Someone had fought her. Marquez pulled every public record she could find: birth certificates, death notices, archived property files. The Rowan branches spread wide, but one detail jumped out again and again. Several male relatives had lived within walking distance of Emily's route home. That was no coincidence. She sat at her desk, tracing each line backward, circling names, crossing out dead ends, tightening the circle one generation at a time. With each connection, the room felt smaller, hotter, heavier. It was as if the case had waited half a century just to place this weight on her shoulders. She whispered under her breath, "Which one of you was there that night?" For the first time, she wasn't searching blindly. For the first time, the evidence was pointing towards someone, not away. Every step brought her closer to the truth Emily left behind with her final breath. End line of subsection, not the final section, end line. The Rowan name was no longer a possibility. It was a warning. Detective Marquez followed the Rowan bloodline through 6 decades of marriages, relocations, and obituaries until only 3 men remained who were alive in 1971, lived near 6th Avenue, and matched the genetic markers. 2 had airtight records, military service logs, hospital stays, verifiable alibis. But the third name stopped her cold. Elias Rowan, a factory worker, a quiet man, a man who never stood out, never drew attention, never left Tacoma, a man whose personnel file listed multiple unexplained absences in the fall of 1971. As Marquez read deeper, her breath caught. Elias had worked the late shift at the tool plant less than 2 blocks from Emily's usual walking route. He clocked out at 10:47 p.m. the night she vanished. Emily left her diner shift at 10:41, 6 minutes apart, walking the same street, the same direction. Her hands tightened around the file. The silence of 50 years was suddenly breaking open at the seams. Detective Marquez pushed her chair back, heart drumming hard. For decades, the town had painted Emily's case as hopeless. An accident, a runaway, a tragedy without a face. But now that face had a name that had been hiding in plain sight for half a lifetime. End line of subsection, not the final section end line. The moment she saw Elias Rowan's file, she knew the past was no longer asleep. Detective Marquez knew she couldn't move on instinct alone. Not with a case this old, not with a family that had waited half a lifetime for truth. So she took the only step that mattered. She ordered a covert DNA retrieval from Elias Rowan's current residence. He was 89 now, frail, quiet, and living in a senior home on the outskirts of Tacoma. To the staff, he was a polite old man who rarely raised his voice. To Marquez, he was a timeline waiting to be tested. A discarded tissue was collected during a routine cleaning, bagged, logged, rushed to the lab. The wait dragged. Hours felt like days. Days felt like years. Every time her phone buzzed, her pulse jumped. She barely slept, replaying Emily's last night over and over, wondering how many clues had been hiding in plain sight. Finally, on a Thursday morning just after sunrise, the forensic analyst called. Her hands shook as she answered. The analyst didn't build suspense. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't delay. He said 5 words that sliced through 50 years of silence. "It's a full match, detective." For a moment, Marquez couldn't speak. The weight of the past, all the grief, all the unanswered questions, all the years of dismissal, landed in one crushing moment. Emily hadn't vanished by accident. She hadn't walked off. She hadn't simply disappeared. Someone took her, and that someone had just been found. All at once, the case that everyone had buried was alive again. Loud, undeniable, roaring for justice. The truth had finally chosen a voice, and it chose her. The moment Elias Rowan's name officially hit the case file, the entire cold case unit paused. Not because he was famous, not because he had a criminal history, but because of the opposite. His record was spotless, his reputation flawless, and his life story perfectly ordinary. Too ordinary. Rowan had spent 4 decades shaping himself into a quiet fixture of Tacoma life. He'd worked as a shipping manager at the old paper mill, volunteered at community picnics, handed out candy at Halloween, and donated to local fundraisers as if kindness were a routine chore. People greeted him on sidewalks, trusted him without question, waved at him from their porches. But innocence isn't measured by smiles, and Marquez knew that better than anyone. When she pulled his archived employment files, one detail made her chest tighten. In 1971, Elias Rowan lived 3 blocks from the diner where Emily worked. 3 blocks, 50 years of searching, and the answer had been sitting in the shadow of her last footsteps. She kept reading. Rowan had reported for work the morning after Emily vanished, clocking in at 6:03 a.m., rigid, punctual, unemotional. His supervisor noted nothing unusual. He finished his shift. He didn't take a sick day. He didn't ask questions. That cold steadiness told Marquez more than any fingerprint ever could. Predators don't always look like the danger you're taught to fear. Some learn to move through life without leaving ripples. Some blend so well that even tragedy can't loosen their mask. And Rowan had worn his for half a century. Marquez stared at his old photograph, a young man with neat hair, a straight posture, and eyes that never quite matched the smile beneath them. She whispered to herself, "You were hiding in plain sight." This wasn't a suspect anymore. This was a lifetime of deception wrapped in a neighbor's face. And she wasn't about to let him slip through her fingers now. The mask wasn't slipping. It was finally being ripped away. Marquez didn't rush. She built a quiet case the way you build a fire in rain. Careful, patient, no wasted motion. Police cars were sent to watch Rowan's modest bungalow for days. They watched his routine, the paper on the porch at dawn, the slow walk to the mailbox, the neighborly nods. He moved through town like a man who belonged to every block. He looked like nothing a jury would fear. Still, they needed proof. The team followed procedure, a warrant for a discarded item, handled with the same respect they'd give a bone. A coffee cup, tossed beside a fast food bin after a community luncheon, was collected under camera observation. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, ordinary, the sort of thing people throw away without thinking. But for years, the smallest things had held the loudest truths. The lab took the cup and under sterile lights found the match, the hair, the touch, DNA. The sequence aligned with the partial profile recovered from Emily's sweater fibers. The machine spit out the confirmation in cold numbers, a match strong enough to demand a follow-up. When Marquez heard the result, she felt every lonely year of the family's vigil press into her ribs. This was the moment the years had been saving up. It was the moment a mother's small, stubborn hope might finally meet proof. They moved carefully to make the arrest. At dawn, teams approached Rowan's house without sirens, without spectacle. He stepped out exactly as he always had, coffee in hand, collar neat, eyes untroubled. When officers identified themselves and read the warrant, his face lost something tiny and private. Not panic, but the instant calculation of a man who'd believed he'd planned forever. Inside his garage, under a tarp and a stack of folded tarpaulins, officers found several items that tightened the case until it hurt. A silver button, thread fibers consistent with Emily's jacket, and an old Polaroid with a young Emily at a diner table, a photo no one had given him permission to keep. The picture was not a trophy in the way thrillers imagine trophies. It was quiet, small, but the presence of it in his garage found its own voice. Rowan's interview that followed was measured, almost weary. He answered slowly, like a man reading from an old script he'd rewritten many times in his head. He denied violence at first, then, under the weight of fiber analysis, location data, and the slow piling of inconsistencies in his past statements, his words began to fray. It wasn't cinematic, it was painfully banal. An argument that escalated, a shove that went wrong, a decision made in panic and then buried in the care of routine. He had told people he helped during the original searches. He had folded himself into grief rituals, stood by memorials, and handed out tissue at vigils. He had watched the family's pain and taken part in it, and in private, he had hidden the cause. For Elena Ramirez, watching the footage of his confession was like watching a wound finally name itself. Her knees buckled in the chair at the community center. She did not cry at first. Her hands were clenched so hard the knuckles whitened. Years of waiting, of phone calls, of holding a porch light, condensed into one thin voice on a recorded tape. The calmness of his tone when he explained what he'd done was intolerable. It stung with the arrogance of a man who believed his ordinary life could bury an extraordinary harm. Neighbors who once praised Rowan's volunteer work now sifted through their memories, cataloging the small oddities they had never thought to mention. The choir director who'd paired him with grieving families felt betrayed. The teens he'd mentored felt hollowed out. Trust doesn't evaporate overnight. It sours, then curdles, then leaves communities bitter and raw. Marquez watched the turning faces of the town the same way she watched evidence under a microscope, with a clinical attention that hid a deep personal anger. How many times had ordinary smiles and civic pride been used as camouflage? How many families had been told to move on because the man across the street was good at charity? The prosecution built a story that refused to romanticize the truth. They presented the fibers, the hair, the Polaroids, and the timeline that placed Rowan within walking distance of Emily's last known route. They showed how he'd volunteered during searches and then returned home to tuck away the things that would silence a life. They did not allow sentiment to soften facts. In the end, the most damning evidence was how ordinary his deception had been. He had not screamed guilt into the town's ears. He had folded himself into its routines, let them trust him, and then treated their trust as insurance. Section N line, he lived among them, praised for kindness, applauded for grace, all while carrying a secret that screamed. The sun hadn't even pushed through the clouds when police cruisers rolled down Rowan Street. It was the kind of soft, pale morning where nothing feels dangerous. The kind where parents make breakfast, kids drag backpacks across the floor, and the world feels predictable. That was the morning they took him. Inside his kitchen, Arthur Rowan sat at his table with a bowl of oatmeal, reading the newspaper like he had every day for decades. Not a tremble in his hand, not a flicker of worry. He didn't pace, didn't peek out a window, didn't act like a man who'd stolen a life 50 years earlier. He ate calmly, as if the world outside had no right to disturb him. Detective Lena Marquez watched from the walkway, her chest tight with a mix of rage and disbelief. This man, this quiet, neatly dressed, well-loved neighbor, had carried a secret heavier than any body. He had survived on routine, on kindness performed for show, on the blind trust of a community that never thought to question him. When the officers knocked, Rowan opened the door with a half-smile, like he was expecting a charity drive. "Mr. Rowan," an officer said, "you're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Emily Carter." The smile didn't disappear. It simply faded inch by inch, the way a candle shrinks when the wick drowns. Rowan placed his hands forward, almost politely. No struggle, no argument, just a man who finally learned that time had run out. Neighbors peeked from windows, jaws slack, hearts racing. They watched a man they had trusted, the same man who fixed fences, watered gardens, and handed out church pamphlets, step into a patrol car without a single word. For the first time in 50 years, Tacoma held its breath. The patrol cars had barely turned the corner when Detective Marquez walked straight toward Rowan's garage. She had waited her entire career for this moment, the moment when truth could finally breathe. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what she knew she was about to find. Rowan's garage was ordinary from the outside, peeling white paint, rusted hinges, a wind chime hanging from a bent nail. The kind of space you'd expect to hold gardening tools and old bicycles. Not the truth that had poisoned a city for half a century. When officers pried open the door, a cold draft washed over them, followed by something worse, the sight of a life stolen and hidden like forgotten objects. On the far wall, dusty shelves held small boxes stacked with the precision of someone who didn't want to be questioned. Marquez opened the first one. Inside lay a silver ring. Emily's initials carved inside the band. Her mother had once said it was the last gift she gave her daughter. The second box held scraps of fabric. When Marquez lifted them, her breath caught in her throat. A familiar pattern, a familiar color. The sweater Emily was wearing the night she vanished. But the third item, the one Rowan had kept closest to him, stopped the entire room. A stack of Polaroids bound with a rubber band so old it snapped with a soft crack. The photo showed Emily in different stages of panic and exhaustion. Proof that she had fought. Proof that she had trusted the wrong doorway. Proof that Rowan had no intention of letting her go. Officers stepped back in grief and anger. Marquez couldn't look away. For 50 years, Tacoma searched for a monster in the dark. He had been standing in the light. News of the arrest didn't spread. It exploded. By noon, local stations had cut into regular programming. Reporters stood outside Rowan's quiet Tacoma home. their voices shaking as they revealed the truth the city never saw coming. Parents clutched their children a little closer. Elderly neighbors collapsed into grief, whispering that they had trusted him, praised him, even thanked him for helping with church events and charity drives. No one could understand how someone so present could hide a past so cruel. At the grocery store, people abandoned their carts mid-aisle just to gather around the radio near the customer service desk. Some cried, some cursed. All felt betrayed. One woman whispered, "He held my son when he was a baby," before breaking down in her friend's arms. Outside the police station, crowds formed with candles, photos, and signs that read, "Justice for Emily." Many attending had never met her, yet they felt like they had lost someone dear. It wasn't just grief. It was the shock of realizing that trust, once broken, leaves scars that stretch across generations. And while the city tried to make sense of the unthinkable, Emily's childhood home became a pilgrimage site. Flowers piled in front of the porch. Neighbors left letters. Someone placed a sketch of Emily, drawn by a young art student, against the railing, the lines trembling with love and anger. For 50 years, Tacoma had carried a wound it didn't know how to speak about. Rowan's arrest didn't heal it instantly, but it finally gave the wound a name. And once a truth like that is exposed, a city can never return to who it was before. The press conference began at 4 p.m., but the crowd gathered long before then. Reporters lined the sidewalk, shivering in the cold breeze, adjusting their microphones with trembling hands. Families of other missing girls stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching photos that had faded with time. There was no chatter, no speculation, only a heavy, aching weight. When Detective Lena Marquez stepped up to the podium, she didn't pretend to be strong. Her voice cracked before she even spoke. She looked at the cameras, then at Emily's portrait placed in front of the microphone and whispered, "We found him." That was all it took. Gasps rose from the crowd like a single breath breaking open. Mothers cried openly, fathers bowed their heads. Even seasoned journalists wiped their faces as they tried to keep filming. Marquez continued, her voice steadier now, driven by the weight of 50 lost years. She explained the breakthrough, the DNA match, the genealogy work, the years of failure that almost erased Emily's name. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "We let this case sit too long," she said, "but today we bring her back into the light." The words hit everyone hard, so behind her, officers lined the steps, some swallowing back tears. They weren't just announcing an arrest. They were confessing a citywide regret that had lived in the shadows for decades. When Marquez finished, she placed a hand on Emily's photo and stepped away from the podium. No one moved, no one breathed. The cameras stayed pointed at the empty space she left behind, as if hoping the truth might keep speaking on its own. And for the first time in 51 years, Tacoma began to feel its voice returning. The hours after the arrest felt unreal, as if the entire city was moving through a fog. Neighbors stood in clusters on their porches, staring at Rowan's house like it had shifted into something unrecognizable overnight. Someone muttered, "He fixed my fence last spring." Another whispered, "He prayed with us when my sister went missing." Each confession cut deeper than the last. By evening, the police tape fluttered in the wind, a thin line separating decades of trust from a truth no one wanted. Parents held their children a little closer. Teenagers who once walked home confidently now asked for rides. Stores that used to stay open late shut their doors early, leaving the streets quieter than they'd been in years. At the Carter home, the news struck harder than anyone expected. Emily's younger brother, who had grown old enough to forget the sound of her voice, broke down in the hallway. Their mother sat at the dining table with shaking hands, staring at the arrest report like she was afraid it might disappear. She whispered the same question over and over. Why now? Why after so long? Detective Marquez visited them before nightfall. She didn't bring comforting phrases or official language, just honesty. She told them the truth, that justice had arrived late, but it had arrived with force. Emily's mother touched the detective's hand and whispered, "Thank you for bringing her home." Meanwhile, across Tacoma, households turned off their televisions early, unsettled by the thought that a man who blended in so well had been capable of such harm. For the first time, the city wasn't asking what happened. It was asking how it went unseen. This shock wouldn't fade quickly. Some wounds leave marks that entire generations feel. By the next morning, Tacoma felt like a city caught between anger and disbelief. News vans lined the street, reporters speaking in clipped, urgent tones as if they too struggled to make sense of what had been uncovered. Every broadcast repeated the same name, Rowan, a name the community had once trusted without question. Crowds gathered outside the police station, some silent, others shouting for answers they knew could never fully repair the past. Older residents came holding faded flyers from the 70s, their edges worn from years of handling. Younger people stood beside them, shocked to learn the story their parents never fully told. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was a shared realization that silence had allowed a killer to blend into their everyday lives. Parents who once let their children ride bikes freely now hovered closely. Teachers whispered to one another in school hallways, shaken by the idea that someone who'd lived so quietly had slipped past every warning sign. Churches held emergency gatherings where congregations sat in pews with bowed heads, questioning how they had welcomed him into their lives without fear. At City Hall, officials scrambled to address decades of oversight. Statements were issued, apologies were made, and promises of reform filled the air, but none of it soothed the ache of a community that felt robbed of its own innocence. Tacoma wasn't just reacting to an arrest. It was confronting the uncomfortable truth that danger can walk beside you for a lifetime without raising suspicion. And everywhere from small homes to crowded workplaces, one question echoed. How many chances had they missed to uncover the truth sooner? The courthouse in downtown Tacoma was overflowing long before the doors opened. People who had lived through 1971 stood shoulder to shoulder with younger residents who had only learned Emily's name after Rowan's arrest. Some clutched tissues, others held old newspaper clippings. But every face carried the weight of a truth they could no longer pretend was distant. Rowan entered the courtroom slowly, escorted by deputies. Age had softened his features, but nothing could soften what he had done. His hands trembled slightly as he took his seat, yet his expression remained blank, a void that only deepened the anger burning quietly across the room. When the judge read the charges, Rowan spoke 4 words that sent a chill through the gallery. Offered plea, Your Honor. He wasn't admitting memory. He wasn't admitting intent. He was admitting the evidence was strong enough to bury him. The reaction whispered through the crowd like a cold current. Frustration, disbelief, and a kind of sorrow that came from knowing the truth without ever hearing him say it aloud. Emily's surviving relatives sat in the front row, holding hands tightly. Their loss wasn't new, but this moment carved a fresh line through their hearts. Detective Marquez watched from the witness section. She had spent 2 years bringing the past back to life, and now she watched the man responsible for that past sit with the calm of someone who had hidden for half a century. The trial had started, but justice had taken its time getting here. The first to approach the stand was Emily's younger cousin, now in her late 50s. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. She took a long breath before speaking, as though the past had settled on her shoulders for decades and only now demanded release. I was 9 when Emily vanished, she began, her voice cracking on the first sentence. She taught me how to braid hair. She taught me how to draw flowers. And for years, I kept looking for her in every crowd. Her words broke, but she pushed through, refusing to let silence swallow her again. You stole a lifetime from her. And from us. Some people in the courtroom looked down, their eyes burning. Others stared directly at Rowan, their grief sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Next came a community member who had known Emily from the diner. He spoke not with anger, but with a soft grief that landed even heavier. She had a way of making people feel seen, he said. She was gentle. She was young. She deserved to grow old. Then Detective Marquez stepped forward. She stood tall, her voice steady but full of something deeper than professionalism. Our tools changed, she said, but the truth never changed. Science remembers what people forget, and it remembered Emily. Rowan didn't look at any of them. Not once, but every word spoken was another door closing behind him, one he would never walk through again. When the testimonies ended, the courtroom felt strangely hollow, as if every story shared had emptied the room of its air. The judge called for a brief recess, but no one moved. People just sat there, staring at Rowan, staring at their hands, staring at the floor, unsure if breathing too loudly might somehow disturb the fragile moment between truth and justice. When court resumed, Rowan stood as instructed. His posture shook slightly. For the first time, age looked like a burden rather than a disguise. His attorney announced the decision they had reached, an Alford plea. Rowan would not admit the act, but he was accepting the mountain of evidence that pointed to him. It was a coward's final shield, but it could not protect him from what came next. The judge's voice was firm, deliberate, and without hesitation. "You will spend the remainder of your life incarcerated," he said. "You denied a young woman her future. You denied a family peace. And for 52 years, you denied this community the truth." A quiet gasp swept through the room. Not surprise, but release. A weight that Tacoma had carried for half a century finally began to crack. Emily's cousin pressed her palms to her face and sobbed. Detective Marquez closed her eyes, letting the verdict settle like a long-awaited breath. And though Rowan showed no reaction, his silence felt like an admission he never had the courage to speak aloud. When the gavel struck, it didn't echo. It landed soft but final, like a door closing on a story that had waited far too long to be heard. When the judge stepped away, the courtroom didn't move at first. It was as if time itself paused to absorb what had finally happened. Emily's name, spoken in that room after so many years of silence, felt like a light pushing back decades of darkness. Then slowly, life returned to the space. Reporters gathered their equipment. Whispered conversations trickled through the rows. A few people reached out to hold the hands of strangers sitting beside them, strangers bound by a grief older than many of them had been alive. Detective Marquez approached Emily's cousin, hesitant at first, unsure whether her presence would help or reopen the ache. But the cousin reached for her, pulling her into a trembling embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You brought her home." Marquez didn't reply. She knew the truth. Justice could speak, but it couldn't heal every wound. Still, she let the moment exist, a brief, fragile bridge between past and present. Across the aisle, Rowan was being escorted out. His steps were slow, not from remorse, but from age. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to look at the people whose lives he'd torn apart. For the first time, the mask he'd worn for 5 decades seemed to slip. Not because he felt guilt, but because the world finally saw him clearly. As the doors closed behind him, the room exhaled, not in triumph, but in recognition that some truths take a lifetime to surface. When the courtroom finally emptied, a soft hush settled over the space, the kind of quiet that follows storms, not celebrations. Emily's photograph rested on the bench beside her family, its edges worn but its message unchanged. She mattered. She always had. And as the last echo of the gavel faded through the hallway, one truth remained. The gavel didn't close her story. It finally let it breathe. By the spring of 2024, Tacoma began carrying Emily's name differently. Not as a rumor, not as a warning, but as a promise finally honored. For the first time in over 50 years, families walked into Wright Park not just to remember her absence, but to celebrate the parts of her life the city had once tried to bury beneath silence. Her memorial now stood beneath an old maple tree, the kind she used to sketch during college. A small plaque read, "For Emily, and the girl who walked with courage." Every April, people gathered there with candles and soft voices, the ground glittering with light as the sun went down. Some brought flowers, others brought drawings. A few stood back at a distance, unsure how to explain the grief they still felt for a young woman they had never met. Detective Lena Marquez attended quietly that first year. She didn't give speeches, didn't seek attention, didn't even stand near the front. She simply watched from the crowd as Emily's name rose above the murmurs, not as a case file, but as someone real, someone loved, the kind of person whose memory deserved warmth, not dust. Older residents whispered stories about 1971, speaking with the honesty they once avoided. Younger people asked questions, trying to understand how a city could forget someone for so long. And for the first time, no one avoided answering. The truth finally felt safe to speak out loud. Tacoma had lost her once. It refused to lose her again. The community wanted to do more than gather once a year. They wanted Emily's name to lift someone the way she once lifted others. So in late 2024, Tacoma launched the Emily Carter Art Scholarship, built entirely from donations, small checks from retirees, folded bills from high schoolers, and anonymous gifts slipped into envelopes outside City Hall. It grew faster than anyone expected, becoming a quiet movement of people who refused to let her story end in sorrow. Each year, one student from Tacoma's art programs is chosen, not for perfect grades, but for heart, for persistence, for the spark Emily carried in every drawing she ever made. Applicants are asked a single question: what do you want your art to say when you're no longer here to say it yourself? The answers have ranged from hopeful to painful to breathtakingly raw. And every time a winner is announced, the crowd looks toward the sky, as if waiting for Emily's family to see what she had inspired decades after her last walk home. Detective Marquez attended the first award ceremony with quiet pride. She watched a nervous 17-year-old girl step onto the stage holding her certificate with trembling hands. The girl whispered, "Thank you, Emily," before walking off. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't rehearsed. It was real, Mamon, a small victory born from a tragedy that had once suffocated the city. That night, as people left the auditorium, someone taped a single sketch to Emily's memorial at Wright Park. A maple leaf, simple, gentle, and full of meaning. Her story was shaping futures she never got to live. Detective Lena Marquez never chased recognition. When the cameras pointed at her during the press conferences, she spoke only about Emily. When reporters tried to turn her into a symbol of triumph, she redirected every spotlight onto the family that had waited 5 decades for truth. But Tacoma didn't forget what she had done, and they didn't let her slip quietly back into ordinary life. In early 2024, the state honored her with the Washington Justice Distinction Award, a title given only to investigators whose cases changed the course of public trust. Lena accepted the plaque with steady hands, but those close enough to see her eyes noticed the grief behind them, the realization that justice had arrived, but far too late for the people who needed it most. During her speech, she paused, looked at Emily's framed photograph on the front row, and said one sentence that silenced the entire auditorium: "Science remembers what people forget." For Emily's surviving relatives, cousins, distant family, even old neighbors who still carried guilt for looking away, the moment felt like someone finally exhaled after holding their breath for half a century. They approached Lena afterward, thanking her not just for solving a case, but for giving them back a story that had been stolen. Later that night, Lena visited the stretch of 6th Ave where Emily was last seen. She stood by the street lamp, hands in her coat pockets, letting the wind move past her. She wasn't there as a detective anymore. She was there as someone who cared. Some people serve justice, others carry it. She carried it. For decades, Tacoma walked around Emily's story like it was a crack in the pavement, something easier to step over than confront. People who once lived on 6th Ave grew old and moved away. New families arrived with no memory of the girl who vanished on a cold October night. Streets were repaved, houses remodeled, stories softened into rumor. But when Rowan's arrest became public, the silence that had blanketed the city for 50 years shattered. Old neighbors came forward, admitting things they had held in their throats for half a lifetime. The uneasy feeling they'd had around Rowan, the strange moments they'd dismissed, the guilt they'd swallowed because they didn't want to be the one who made trouble. Younger residents listened in disbelief, realizing the peaceful image they'd inherited had been built on avoidance. Community meetings filled faster than the chairs could hold. People spoke openly about the fear that once kept them quiet, the regret that still clung to them, and the anger that it took science, not courage, to force the truth into daylight. At a local library forum, a woman who had been Emily's classmate stood up, voice trembling, and said, "We should have said her name every year. We should have refused the silence." For the first time since 1971, the city acknowledged the wound instead of pretending it wasn't there. And in that honesty, late, heavy, imperfect, Emily stopped being a rumor and returned to being a person. A life remembered, a story reclaimed, a truth finally spoken aloud. Wright Park glows softly under the evening sky as the annual memorial begins. Families gather with quiet steps, carrying candles, handwritten notes, and photographs that have survived generations. The wind moves gently through the trees, as if carrying the voices of those who once stood here decades earlier, searching for answers that never came. Now they gather not in confusion but in honor, reclaiming a name that was once spoken only in whispers. Lanterns are passed from hand to hand. When they rise, drifting slowly toward the night sky, each flame reflects the hope Emily never had the chance to witness. Children point upward, unaware of the long shadow this case once cast. Older residents watch with heavy eyes, understanding how deeply one life can shape a city. Detective Lena Marquez stands near the water, the reflection of lanterns shimmering at her feet. This case changed her. It taught her that justice may sleep, but it doesn't disappear. She bows her head as Emily's photo appears on the memorial screen. Young, bright, full of promise. The applause that follows is not loud. It is reverent, the kind that comes from a community finally willing to face its past. As the lanterns drift across Commencement Bay, the scene slows, the camera drawing back to reveal their warm glow over dark water. Emily's story closes not with silence, but with light. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten, and because she held on, so did justice.